This is Dr. Lisa Marie Bobby, and you're listening to the Love, Happiness, and Success podcast. That's the track Healing Love by pianist Oliver Riz from his album of solo piano pieces called Beginnings. I don't know about you, but I could listen to that all day. I feel better already. Conventional wisdom says that we need to love ourselves first and that you should be over any past relationships before starting a new one. But the reality is that healing our emotional wounds isn't something that happens all at once. And a lot of times, our wounds occur through our relationships, and they are healed through relationships. And to help us unpack all of those big ideas, I have invited my colleague, Paige Mcallister, to speak with us today. Paige is a marriage and family therapist on the team here at Growing Self, and she's also a doctoral candidate in marriage and family therapy. She has a background in so many relevant things. She has expertise in sexuality, in interpersonal violence, in trauma, and she has done so much wonderful healing work, both with individuals and couples on the path to healing on every level. And I am so excited to invite her into the conversation today to share her expertise with you. So thank you, soon to be Dr. Paige, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Do you get a little thrill when people call you Dr. Paige? Even just, it's exciting.
I do.
Hard earned.
Yes.
We were just chatting a little bit before we started this interview that you are in the final stages of the dissertation process and talking about how amazing it's going to feel to be on the other side of that. So congratulations in advance. That's a big achievement. And you, in addition to that, have so much experience in helping people, particularly in healing from trauma. And so just to kind of catch our listeners up a little bit here. So one of the things that we do in our practice here at Growing Self that I love so much is that we have different kind of like community events in our group where we'll talk as a group about different topics. And some of it is personal growth in nature, but some of it is professional growth in nature. And you hosted a group the other day that I was so privileged to be in attendance of. And you were talking about healing relationships and the significance of them in our work. And I just left that group wanting to know more. And so maybe we can just start there. I mean, healing relationships. What do you think of when you think about healing relationships?
Yeah. Well, I came to this idea through like my own work with trauma, survivors of trauma, and thinking about what kind of relationship did we need to have in the room in order for them to heal.
Between you and your clients.
Yeah, between me and my client. So I was thinking like, okay, well, if trauma is violent and it violates boundaries and it's unpredictable and people don't take accountability for the harm that they've done, then in therapy, we need to have some predictability and some structure. And I need to acknowledge that I can do harm. And then I think it just naturally flowed out of that to think about and talk with my clients about those kind of relationships that they have with other people in their lives. Like we're doing a very specific type of healing work as a therapist and a client, but they were doing lots of that healing work on their own outside of session. And yeah, so when I think of relationships for healing, I think of like egalitarian relationships. And I mostly just the opposite of trauma, not the absence of harm, but more than that, the presence of support and trust and safety and consistency and a place where people say they're sorry and mean it when they've done something that's caused harm.
I love what you just said. And I honestly hadn't thought about it in that way, that it's not just the absence of trauma. Like a good relationship is not the absence of things that lead to a bad relationship, that you're saying that there are actually very specific positive qualities that a healing relationship has. And you can create that kind of relationship with a good therapist, but that you can also have those kinds of healing qualities in a relationship with a partner or friends, families, loved ones. Can you say a little bit about why it is so important for people who have lived through hard things to have healing relationships with others?
It's important, because we are social creatures and we all need people around us, and we all deserve to have positive, fulfilling relationships. I think it's especially important for people who have had damaging or traumatic relationships to have them, for their healing, but also because they deserve them, because as humans, we deserve that. And also that when, like, in good healing relationships, they're not just one way, right? They're reciprocal. So it's not just that I'm supported and loved, but I get to support and love others. And I think we all need those experiences as well.
Gives us an opportunity to see ourselves showing up in positive ways in relationships, that can be very healing as well. Yeah.
And the number one thing I work on with survivors of trauma is helping to reestablish autonomy, because trauma takes so much away from us. And then when we're, living with traumatic responses, our behaviors, our emotional reactions often feel so out of our control. And we're not really choosing how we're responding in this situation. We're just going into survival mode and doing what we feel like we have to do. And so healing relationships can be a place for people who have been any kind of trauma, but especially trauma that happens within relationships, to be able to show up the way they want to, and to determine how that relationship is going to go, and have some autonomy there, which I think supports overall healing. When trauma feels like it takes so much away from us, that in healing relationships, I do have control. I do get a say, which I think just, is really critical to healing overall, to feel autonomous.
Well, and you're bringing up so many important points here. And I think maybe for the benefit of our listeners, I think when therapists use the word trauma, we're often thinking of different things than some, just a bad experience. And also that there are different kinds of trauma. There are traumas where your physical safety is threatened, or you are hurt, or you're witnessing something horrible happening to other people. And there is also such a thing as relational trauma, which is a very real trauma, but I feel like we don't talk about that kind of trauma as much. Can you take us just into that? I know we've tried to talk about it a bit on past podcasts around trust issues, healthy relationships, but I don't know that we've really unpacked relational trauma on the show before. Can you say more about that?
Yeah.
No pressure.
I was going to say, it's a big one.
It is.
And also, in general, I use a really expanded definition of relational trauma, because I think it's most helpful. But relational traumas are things that happen in the context of relationships that threaten our relational safety, just like violence or natural disasters can threaten our physical safety. And I find with my clients often, those are the traumas that are harder to identify for them. That they're like, well, my parents or my caregivers, they didn't hit me, they fed me, and they provided a roof over my head. So I shouldn't be upset about the other things that happened. But then they tell me these stories about emotional neglect, that people didn't take care of their emotions, didn't help them navigate their own emotions, that when they, as children, had really big emotions, parents and caregivers tried to shut that down, either because they were uncomfortable, or they didn't know what to do, or they were overwhelmed, or they were told that they were being dramatic or childish, but they were a child. So of course there was, they're just expressing normal emotions, and the way people responded were really critical or negative, or they just ignored them. And so I think that's harder. I think those are the kinds of traumas that are harder to recognize. but fit within like a relationship.
And hard to validate, because just as you're talking, I'm sitting here thinking that we really, I think, don't do enough in our culture to talk about the very real attachment needs that we have, particularly as children. They're very much tied in to survival drives. I mean, they are fundamental needs to feel safe and respected and understood by the people around you on an emotional level, that like security. And that when that is threatened or damaged, it is quite damaging to people, but we don't talk about that reality. And so I think that people struggle to like legitimize their own feelings when that's coming up for them. Is that?
Yeah. And also because like when we're children, when I'm 8, 9, 10, I can't just go off and
this isn't a fundamental attachment need right now, Mom. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. And because like I need my parents both to take care of me emotionally and to provide for me physically, I don't have choice in those relationships. I don't just get to go find new parents if the ones I have aren't doing what I need them to do for whatever reason. And so, yeah, I think it's hard for people to validate, but also just like the trappedness of, I can't choose another relationship here. But we do have when we talk about childhood trauma, and this also came up in my dissertation work with survivors of intimate partner violence, the narratives that we have are really overt, extreme demonstrations of physical violence, sexual violence, neglect, like extreme neglect, where like people aren't being fed and basic needs aren't being met. That's what we tend to talk about. When we talk about intimate partner violence, kind of the image people have in their minds is really extreme physical or sexual violence. But there's all sorts of emotional violence, verbal violence, neglect in those areas as well. We just don't talk about them as much. So we don't have those narratives. And it's also been my experience, people are really uncomfortable. Like if identifying as a survivor of trauma now means a bunch of things for me. So I think there's some self-protection there as well.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that part, because, and I like the way that we're sort of breaking this down a little bit. Like there's relational trauma that happens in, childhood, a time in our lives when we're vulnerable, we're really dependent on people in a very real way, and that impacts us. And then certainly there can be relational trauma, romantic relationships or friendships. But can you talk a little bit about the impact of relational trauma when you experience as a child?
Fundamentally, it changes our view of ourselves and how we relate to other people. When we're children, we don't know much else. So if we look at the researchers doing really great work on childhood trauma, and chronic stress is often what they call it, adverse childhood experiences. They talk about like the buffering aspect that can happen with a strong, stable adult to show what that relationship can look like.
A healing relationship.
Yeah. But if we don't have that, or if most of our relationships are relationships with our primary caregivers, our parents, are traumatic or aren't fully meeting our needs instead of meeting our needs, often the way it changes how we view ourselves and others is, it's not a one-to-one. It's not just like this. It is somewhat true that in those initial relationships, we learn about what we deserve. We learn about, like, that's our main example of what human relationships look like. So we can internalize some beliefs about ourselves, about what we deserve, about what we're worth. In addition to, when we talk about other types of trauma, we talk about an increased like vigilance for danger in the world and having trauma responses where we're triggered by something and we go into fight, flight, or freeze because our central nervous system is activated. That all holds true with relational trauma as well, depending on the severity of it. But we will develop ways to survive in those relationships. So if I'm a child and when I am showing big emotions or any emotions at all, I'm told I'm dramatic and people get mad at me, I might just start shoving those emotions down and down and down. And the message I'm getting from everyone is my emotions are too much. So I'll just put those in a box and put that box in a bigger box. It's not really how emotions work. They're going to pop out in other places and sometimes in bigger ways because we're not working through emotions as they come. Other people might, rebel against that. Maybe I'm going to do more dramatic things because I'm trying to get attention. I'm trying to get care. I'm trying to take care of my own emotions and I don't know what to do because I'm a child. So we develop ways to survive. Everyone's got their own thing that they do. It looks different for everyone, but we often take those survival strategies into adulthood, even into relationships that are healthy or could be healthy. And then we're still acting on those survival strategies of, trying to manage ourselves in relationships by editing our behaviors or I don't like the phrase like acting out, but we're trying to do something. And so it's not that we're being malicious, but we're trying to protect ourselves. So we might engage in behaviors and relationships that are not helping us accomplish those goals.
I think this is maybe tying back to what you were saying at the beginning of our conversation, like the idea of autonomy, meaning that you have sort of control and independence and volition. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that understandably, people who have been experienced relational trauma, especially earlier in life, may be having feelings that are coming out in ways that are sort of uncontrollable in some ways. Like they're big feelings, they're manifesting in weird behaviors that they themselves don't fully understand, or they are being, like you use the word editing, sort of containing themselves to the degree that it's impacting like intimacy, vulnerability in a relationship. So it can look like a lot of different things. And just that it carries over, it's like ghosts from the past that don't sometimes have anything to do with the relationship that you're actually in the present.
Which is really frustrating when you're experiencing it. Because I think most people with trauma, it's not one or the other, it's kind of all of it. So there are moments where they're doing these behaviors to protect themselves, like pushing people away or, coping with intense emotions, maybe in ways that they don't want or aren't as healthy, as well as trying to contain it and edit it. And I think that's part of the struggle of trauma is it's extremes in multiple ways that sometimes it's our emotions are too big and other times it's that we're trying to keep them very small and neither of them are both of those are very frustrating, exhausting processes and also can be really difficult to manage within the context of a relationship that somebody wants and with people that they trust and love.
Right. So I want to talk more about that, like the healing relationship idea, because that is really a crucial component of healing for people who have had that life experience. But we have to talk about something else too, which is that, I can't tell you how many clients I've worked with who have been in love with someone, they're in a relationship with someone who has experienced relational trauma in their past and who is still like kind of dealing with the impacts of it. And they are working so hard to be a kind partner, to have a healing relationship for that other person. And at least in my experience, that is not actually enough and to change it. And so like working with clients would be like, I thought I could help him. I thought that through the power of our love, that it could be different. And they get hurt in the process. So healing relationships, certainly crucial. We'll talk more about that. But there's sort of a bigger problem because it seems like the person who has had that early trauma needs to be aware of it and actively participating in that healing in different ways in order for a healing relationship to be beneficial. Would you agree with that? Or do you see it? I mean, you have a lot more experience in this than I do. I'm coming at it from a very like couples counseling kind of orientation where you're the trauma expert in this conversation. So what have you seen with that?
I strongly believe that like individual therapy to really process trauma, like structured processing of trauma is really helpful when it's happened. I think that relational trauma or relational healing is helpful and critical. But when there have been intense traumas, when people are experiencing lots of trauma responses in their everyday life or in the context of their relationship, then individual therapy would be really beneficial and sometimes critical before we can move forward. I also talk to my clients about, and this is a therapist trick. I don't know if you've talked about on the podcast before, but externalizing the trauma. So we take the trauma out of the person. You are not your trauma. But in relationships, trauma very much becomes a third entity, like a third person in the conversation we're having, a third actor in the dynamics of our relationship. And we both need to be able to look at it and see it for what it is. I often find as well that, when one partner is trying to heal someone else with their love, they aren't always asking. Sometimes they feel like they have to be kind of delicate with that person. They can't ask for accountability. They just got to give and give and give love, and that's what's going to fix it. But in a healing relationship, it's egalitarian. Like we're both being accountable to each other. It's not that one person is always accommodating for the other or, trying to make it better or like holding their own feelings back because you've been through so much, so I can't bring it up.
Yeah. Well, it's not a healing relationship for the other person at that point. That is not a healthy relationship for both people. It's imbalanced. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, then, just for the purposes of this conversation, because that self-awareness of, I do have trauma that is maybe coming out in my relationships. It is my responsibility to do something about this so that I can be a good partner to my partner. What would your guidance be for some, just like, how do you know if the things that, because I mean, every single one of us can scroll back through our mind's eye and think about the time that our mom yelled at us or whatever it was. So like, how do you develop that gauge of this is actually, it impacted me, it's still impacting me, I need to do something about this? What would your tips be for someone?
If there are other mental health struggles going on, if there's depression and anxiety, anything in that range, if you're already meeting with a therapist, I would just ask your therapist, like, so I think this thing might be impacting me, and have a clinical conversation about it. My clients don't always know to bring it up. I try to ask good questions, but sometimes we just don't know it's something.
But again, like that, if we're not aware that it was a trauma, we're not legitimizing it. Like, how do you even know that it's something to talk about in therapy? Like, I had a critical parent or whatever.
Kind of the sign that I look for in my clients and help them talk through is, are there situations where your emotional reaction is out of proportion to what happened? It is either too big or it's too small. So this thing happened and all of a sudden I jumped to like 100% anxiety. I got so overwhelmed. Anything in that range, like my emotional reaction, it's a frustrating thing that happened, but I go to like rage.
Yeah.
Or just immediate panic. Or it's something that happened. And I think the out of proportion is key because we're allowed to have feelings. We're going to have feelings about the things that happen in our lives. But if we notice that we're just like shut down emotionally, that our emotions just...
Like we had a fight and I would not talk for 3 days, like that kind of thing. There's, something there. Yeah.
If the way you're responding to things feels confusing to you, if it's mysterious, like, I don't know why I reacted that way. It wasn't how I wanted to react, but you said something or this thing happened and I just, my gut reaction was this and I had to run away. I had to shut down. multiple days.
So like that, like losing control of yourself a little bit.
Yeah. So those are some of the big things. Kind of the classic PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms are I'm having flashbacks or nightmares. I have an increased startle response. So that could, be happening, and that would be a good indication. But for some of those relational traumas, I think it's more in like our individual responses to things, just paying attention to them. But clients that I've worked with that have experienced relational trauma, they don't feel in control of it, and it feels really confusing and exhausting. And both in terms of like in the context of relationships and in other situations in their lives.
Okay, here's another question. And I hope that this is okay to ask, but like on the show, we've talked before about attachment styles. And so secure attachment, kind of an avoidant attachment, an anxious attachment. What is the difference between an attachment style and a relational trauma, particularly that happens like earlier in life? Or do you see like a lot of overlap in that, or are there differences? I've never even thought about this before our conversation today, so I don't know if this is a fair question or not.
I haven't thought about it a ton, and I'm not like an attachment expert, but all the trauma people reference attachment, right? Attachment theory is really foundational. I think there's overlap between attachment styles and relational trauma and our responses to relational trauma. The way I talk about it with clients is that we're all managing needs for connection and needs for autonomy in relationships. And like a secure attachment is, I can hold both of those. I can be close to you. I can be connected to you. I also can be on my own and have my own goals and hobbies and interests, where avoidant attachment is, I can't stand being close to people, so I'm going to go off here on my own little island. Anxious attachment, I can't stand being away from you, so I'm going to pull you in close. And I think often with people with relational trauma, there's more disorganized attachment where sometimes I'm feeling really anxious and I need you close. Other times I'm feeling anxious about you being too close and I'm going to push you away. So that fits within like our understanding of attachment styles. That's how I explain it to my clients, though, because I think sometimes people can identify with a label. And I'm sure you've talked about this with attachment styles, like they really cling to that label, like this label is
it's
me.
Not that helpful. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think it can be helpful in certain ways, like to just understand yourself more compassionately. And I heard somebody say, I think it might even been somebody in our group, that there's no such thing as a perfectly securely attached person. Like we all sort of fall to one side or the other. We all have in certain situations, different reactions that could be avoidant, could be anxious, sort of depending on what's going on. So I hear you. I'm 100% there.
So I think trauma can help maybe understand, like, why is this kind of more my go-to, or like help explain if it is both. If I'm feeling kind of a push-pull, like I want you close, but not too close. I think trauma does a lot to explain that. And then honestly, the work in therapy is looking at the exceptions as well. Like, when are you able to balance that? And how are you doing that? So
that's good to remember. So then turning our attention back to this idea of a healing relationship, one of my takeaways, honestly, from what we've just been talking about is this idea that even if you're trying to have a healing relationship with somebody who is unwell, who has unresolved trauma, it is not going to be a healthy relationship for you, right? And so I guess because, part of this, I think that many people, many of our listeners have had adult relationships, and maybe in addition to early stuff, but like certainly adult relationships that felt toxic, that felt damaging, that felt really traumatic. I mean, and so do you think that there's a correlation between somebody having a traumatic relationship experience as an adult? Is that an indication that maybe the partner that they were with was so traumatizing to them, probably a good indication that their partner had some stuff that maybe neither of them were aware of at the time they were in that relationship with each other. Is that fair to say, or am I extrapolating too far? I want answers, Paige.
Yeah, and I'm a therapist, so I'm going to say, well, it really depends. Sometimes,
right.
Definitely. There's just so much that plays into how we treat each other.
Yeah.
Right. So my own trauma is definitely going to impact how I'm treating others, especially in close relationships.
Yeah.
I think sometimes people, like you mentioned, are aware where they're like, well, I know my partner's been through all these things.
Right.
I'm just going to try to heal them, fix them with my love. I also think just our general narratives about what relationships are and our developmental phase play into that as well. Having, worked with teens and young adults that are out in kind of their first relationships, trying to decide what relationships are, don't always have good skills or good models of, this is what a healthy relationship looks like. But definitely trauma impacts how we treat each other and how we're able to show up in our relationships.
All right. And so although healing a relationship is not enough, it is really a crucial ingredient. I mean, if you have lived through toxic or damaging traumatic relationships in the past, a lot of important growth and healing does happen in the context of relationships. And can you talk a little bit more about what that can look like for people? And so in particular, I'm thinking of somebody who was maybe mistreated in previous relationships. It damaged their self-esteem. It damaged their trust. It was traumatic. How can a new relationship, a healing relationship, help start to resolve some of that?
Yeah. I think firstly, it's got to be the right person. And I always help my clients think through like trauma, especially relational trauma, is going to tell me that all humans are unsafe. All the people could be dangerous. When we work through our trauma and we're working towards autonomy, then I get to decide who I trust and who I don't, who I let in. But healing relationships with others, and this is like the scientist in me struggles with this part because there's something about it that's not magical, but it's like that feeling of being in a relationship that's strong and supportive that is like, feels like a hug, even when you aren't getting a hug.
Yeah.
When we can show up as ourselves, when we can share parts of ourselves and we're validated and we're accepted. Yeah. All the words that are coming to mind are just the word again. Like it's so healing to be in those relationships.
Yeah, but it's compassionate, it's emotionally safe. And I think I'm also hearing between the lines, like you were talking about that feeling understood, feeling accepted. That makes me wonder if part of that key ingredient of having a healing relationship is that your partner knows and understands your trauma and your trauma response, so that when you do have those moments, maybe when you feel scared or angry, they're able to see that for what it is, as opposed to doing that like typical relationship dance. I think many times when people don't understand what or why their partner is sort of reacting the way they do, it becomes very easy to kind of be mad at your partner for being mad or be defensive in response. And so you're saying that like healing relationship is almost the opposite of that. Like, I see that you're getting triggered right now, and like sort of meeting that with compassion as opposed to, more criticism or rejection. Is that part of it, that like understanding?
Yeah. And that as the partner, maybe without trauma, or maybe the partner with my own trauma, I can view your trauma as separate from you. You are still a whole human being to me who is making choices and doing things that impact me, but you are a human being, that you are not your trauma. And I can hold space for your trauma impacting the choices that you're making, the things you're saying, or the way that you're saying them. And I think really critical to healing relationships is that there is a lot of repair. Like when trauma responses come up, when we when we don't show up the way we want to, there is space to make it right, that we can apologize, that we can come together and discuss what actually was going on. How can we take care of this together? But if there are like big relational triggers in a healing relationship, we're going to do everything we can to avoid those triggers. If it's, something like yelling comes up for my clients a lot, right? Like I grew up in a chaotic household, like I can't handle yelling. I just go into survival mode right away. So those two partners do like work really hard to not have yelling be a part of their relationship, find other ways to work through it. I think healing relationships also, and this is something I work with couples that they're navigating this a lot, we need to take lots of breaks. We need to slow down and be able to soothe our trauma response so that we can have productive conversations. And so in healing relationships, there's lots of space. We can slow it down. We can take a break and come back. Yeah.
Yeah. But like giving ourselves and each other permission to like stay in a good place and be like self-aware enough to know like this, I can't keep having this conversation right now. So one of the things I'm thinking about two different situations right now. I'm thinking about a couple, and I'm sure that you have seen this couple, but so it's a relationship where no betrayal has occurred and one of the partners has experienced betrayal in a previous relationship, either, sexual infidelity, financial infidelity. Like they were really traumatized by a previous relationship. And now they are in a new relationship and they're having those like anxious flare-ups and that vigilance. And over time, that does, I think, start to take a toll on a lot of partners because they're like, I didn't do that to you. I haven't done anything wrong. And I know that this is like a big thing. And this is not the kind of thing that can be resolved through a couple of pieces of advice. There is a experiential healing process that people go through. It takes months, sometimes years. But generally speaking, what would your advice be for a couple who is grappling with that kind of dynamic? And it is eroding kind of the safety and health of their relationship. How do they identify it? Where would they even start to move back to a healing relationship space?
Yeah, my biggest advice is to start to do what you can as a partner that has experienced that betrayal, that trauma, to externalize that trauma. And the way I talk about it with my clients is, what is your trauma telling you? Like, what is trauma saying? In these moments where you're having this anxiety, potentially your trauma is saying, my current partner is going to hurt me just like my past partner did.
Yeah.
Like, I'm watching this movie play out again. I don't want to be hurt again. I need to protect myself. When we're just caught up in those anxious thoughts, they feel like us. They feel like our own thoughts. So even just saying like, this is what my trauma is telling me. This is what my anxiety is telling me. And being able to communicate that to the partner instead of, making accusations or like, I need to check your phone. I need, those other things that we can do when anxiety gets really high. We would say, my anxiety is telling me that I am unsafe right now. And then we can have a conversation around it rather than always dealing with kind of the behavioral fallout.
You're cheating on me. Like the accusations and the right.
Yes. And so if we can have a conversation from a space of, this is what my trauma is telling me, and start to have that conversation.
Yeah.
I think that's really, really critical. And in those moments where, I think this is helpful with all anxiety, is just check our thoughts a little bit. Like, is this actually true? Or is this just feeling true? And this feeling is coming from this place that I can identify, that I know where this is coming from.
I'm so glad we're talking about this right now, Paige, because I think that this reality, this truth often surprises people. Like I tell my clients all the time, like, don't get tricked into believing everything you think or everything that you feel, because I think there's so much like pop psychology that, everything you think and everything you feel
Listen
is
to your
like
gut.
this true. Exactly. And we're as like, actually, that's not always helpful. And to be able to have that sort of psychological distance, but like that meta awareness of like how you're thinking, how you're feeling in the moment that is maybe not actually, it's like an artifact of trauma as opposed to some fundamental truth that you need to take action on right this very second. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I think that that is just so crucial to be known. And so one last thing. So we talked about a relationship where one of the partners had in a previous relationship experienced relational trauma. And here is a trick question, hopefully not a trick question, pop quiz. You know, I know you too, have also worked with so many couples where there has been trauma, betrayal in the context of the relationship. And it's not that some, you know, horrible other person 5 years ago hurt me. It's that actually you hurt me. There was an affair, there was financial infidelity, something of that nature. Do you feel that the path of healing and recreating a emotionally safe, healing relationship is similar in those circumstances? Or does it look a little bit different in your experience?
I think it looks a little different because we have that person who's caused the harm still there.
Yes. Yeah.
And they can take accountability. But something I've been thinking a lot about in this context comes from Dr. Harriet Lerner's work on apologizing. She recently came out with a book on it, and she talks about how like an apology...
Is this like apology languages? Or is it different?
It's different. I think the book is called Why Won't You Apologize?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. She talks about how an apology validates the experience of the person harmed. And I've been thinking about that a lot in terms of relationships where one person has caused harm. Like we have to validate the experience of the harm that was done, which is really uncomfortable. It is very uncomfortable to look inside yourself and actually like own up to that rather than, you know, when we're trying to just make it better. So we're saying whatever we can think of or do to just make it better. Like, please stop being mad at me. Rather than like, I recognize that this is what was going into it for me. And this is what I did. And this caused you harm in this way, this way, and this way.
Yeah.
When there's been betrayal in relationships, I use the language of trauma with my clients. We talk about trauma responses and triggers, and we talk about self-soothing and working toward safety so that that couple can soothe together. But until we're there, we're going to build up to that emotional safety and normalizing that for people. Like that, of course, you're not feeling totally safe to do that. And that's okay. Like we're going to work toward it. Everyone's going to get space here.
Right. Well, and what a useful model to be bringing in the idea of trauma to those situations, because I think, you know, it's almost a cliche. The person who did the betrayal is like, that was such a long time ago. Why are you still upset? Nothing is happening. I've like totally reformed. And I think there's this lack of awareness that there is still a very active trauma response that gets triggered by certain things that's very real and is the legacy of that relational trauma. And that does not go away easily. But I think that people imagine that you've heard that phrase, like, it's time to get over it, right? And just like, that is not how humans work. And so bringing that idea of the impact of relational trauma to those situations, I think is a very compassionate way of looking at it that helps people wrap their heads around what's happening and why.
Yeah, I agree.
Why the feelings persist.
Yeah. And give us some language to talk about why it's still there, and kind of give us a path forward. Like if we know this is a relational wound, well then we've got some steps. Like how are we going to address this wound? And I think at least a part of it's hard is because in our culture we're fairly punitive. Like we think about like when people have done things wrong, they deserve to be punished. But that doesn't heal in the relationship.
No.
So we've got to think of different ways to interact around harm that's been done. so that we can find healing. And often that includes some of those other things about a healing relationship that we've got to not just trust, but maybe in addition to a loss of trust, there was, I'm losing the train a little bit here, but
oh, it's okay. Well, and I won't keep you, but I'm glad that we're talking about this. And I think that my biggest takeaways from this conversation is just the impact of relational trauma, and that it's something we should all really be aware of, both in ourselves and our partners. And that in addition to, we're working on ourselves in productive ways, really working to create healing relationships with our partners. And also, I think having expectations that we deserve to be in healing relationships too, because, none of us come through this life unscathed and unscarred. Every single one of us is carrying wounds of one kind or another. And so to be real compassionate and intentionally cultivating that healing space in between you and the people that you love. So thank you. Thank you so much for joining me today, Paige. This was a wonderful conversation. I appreciate your time and just all the wisdom that you shared with our listeners today.
Yeah, thank you.